normally in a room full of people, people ask, well, who are the IRU? And I'm pleased to say that the IRU is a group of 7 now institutions. We've just welcoming Western Sydney University, which I'm incredibly excited about, and I'm looking forward to exploring the facility and coming back down next week to meet more of the staff who are here. But as you can see, as the IRU Vice Chancellor's Fellow, I get around a lot in the geographical sense and work with all of our partner institutions on a series of projects, which I will speak to a little bit later in the talk. But basically my work is to support student and graduate success and to help our 7 institutions think differently about the ways in which we can collaborate to support students. So we've all heard that the landscape for the future of work is dramatically changing, and we've seen the statistics coming out of the CEDA report that about 40% of Australian jobs that exist today may not exist in the next 10 to 15 years, and that we're looking down the barrel of potentially 5.1 million jobs being lost. Something that we've all heard before, again, is that our young people today could be looking at 17 careers across 5 industries. And as an academic, as a career academic, I find that almost incomprehensible to think that my students could potentially be transitioning across so many different industries. What's even more concerning is about 58% of university students and over 70% of vocationally educated students are training for a career path that may not exist. And that's not just that their career path may not exist in 10 to 15 years, but their chosen career path may not exist at the time of graduation. This isn't new. Changing technology has put jobs at risk since the dawn of time. I really like these examples. So the lamplighter used to walk around the streets in the UK and light gas lamps, and prior to that, light candles to help protect people and keep the streets safe. Now, obviously, electricity put these poor people out of their jobs. And by the early 20th century, basically all of the gas lamps that were in existence became electric. Another job, which is actually my favourite job of all time, the knocker-upper, used to walk down the street and knock on your window to wake you up in the morning. All you had to do was tell them when you wanted to be woken up at the day before, let them know, and they would come down. He even had a snooze function where you could say, please wake me up, get to the end of the street and come back again and knock again to wake me up. After your first snooze, there was no second or third snooze. He just kept knocking until you stuck your head out the window and actually told him that you had woken up. Obviously, the alarm clock did away with that vitally important job, and now even the alarm clock is becoming obsolete as we're all using our mobile devices to help us know when we should be able to wake up in the morning. So any job that's at risk or has been deceased due to technology, we call zombie jobs. Now, this isn't a title that I made up. Christopher Redman from the UK, the University of Manchester, coined this phrase, the zombie job, and I love it. So it's any job that a machine could potentially do for us. So you don't need a brain, you don't necessarily need emotional intelligence to be able to do this job. And when we think about the jobs that we have currently, there are a large number of zombies walking around in our current lives. When I think back to my childhood, so I'm in my 30s, so probably not as old as some, but I think about the garbage man and how fond I was of the garbage man, or the 2 or 3 garbage men who used to come around and jump our fence into our backyard, negotiate our dog, pull out our bins and take them out into the bin. Now one person does that job. I'm still fascinated how they can pull their big truck back and still pick up my wheelie bin. But I come from a long line of dairy farmers, and my great-grandfather would roll in his grave to know now that our family dairy farm is 24/7 and that we don't even have to be there to have it operational. Cows now have the capacity to choose when they want to be milked. How's that for user design? So a cow will come in and say, I'm ready to be milked. It's 4 a.m. They come in, everything is done down to the disinfecting of the teats before they collect the milk. And then they even have the capacity now to test the quality of that milk and make a determination about whether that milk ends up in the vat based on the temperature of the milk as it's coming out of the cow's udder. We all know about the automation of the automotive industry, and obviously we don't have hand sorting mail or the wonderful ladies who used to help us connect our phone calls. And the poor old Milko, he's gone too. So about 5% of all of the jobs that we do now have the capacity to be fully automated with our current technology. And what I think is even more difficult to understand is about 60% of all of the jobs that we have now could be reduced by a third. That's today, without the exponential increases in technology that we're seeing across the board. My Mac is playing havoc with the text, sorry about that. We've all seen the way that technology is helping to drive our own customer behaviour. So I spend a lot of time on aeroplanes, and I have never checked myself in with a person. I always like to use the machine or check myself in, even online. At Coles, we've all used machines to help us scan our groceries, potentially booked our travel online, putting more and more workers out of jobs. And even now, some of us may have used online websites to help us lodge our tax returns and potentially get ourselves claims back for our medical insurance. The example I really love is in Japan, where there is a hotel that's using robots to check you in. Now, what's awesome about this hotel is that there's 2 robots and you get your choice. One of them is this lovely female robot here. The other one is a dinosaur. How cool is that? You can get checked in at your hotel by a talking dinosaur. A sign of things to come. So there are lots of jobs that aren't necessarily low-skilled jobs that are being put out of business. My grandfather is a jeweler, and his bespoke jewellery service is now looking at rapidly changing as machines can now make jewellery much faster than any person can. And we can even now synthetically create diamonds. So one diamond isn't necessarily the same as another. But for us in higher education, the range of zombie graduate jobs is the thing I think we need to be most concerned about. Accountancy and law, we're not talking about the highly skilled components of those jobs, but rather the jobs that are available that a computer could do for us. So a computer like Watson could potentially be sourcing for us all of the legal precedent that would apply to a case and do a lot of legal secretarial work and lower skilled workers out of their jobs in terms of the paralegals. Surveyors now are looking at a changing workforce landscape as GPS technology changes the way in which we're surveying the ground and potentially creating the kinds of buildings and where they will sit. Human resources and recruitment, there are programs now that can source through thousands of resumes and online applications, which means that for our graduates, they need to be very, very careful about the ways in which they craft their applications to ensure their applications are even going to get past the computer algorithm that sits at the front end. There are programs out there now that will write the news for us, particularly in the financial areas of papers. You can have a computer that will literally write the whole article and send it off to the editor. A little difficult for opinion pieces, but for the easy ones, potentially. So if we think back to this diagram, I'm a biochemist by training, And you look at something like this and my colleagues say, well, it's fine. The scientists are fine. Our students will be okay. But even the sciences, medicine and health aren't immune to these changes in technology. They're just not feeling it quite so hard as some other markets at the moment. You think about IBM Watson, it can diagnose cancer much more efficiently and effectively than any doctor on the planet, based on the information that you put in at the front end. Now, a lot of my work is in pharmacy. Pharmacists, we may not need them in years to come, as our technology is available that would allow us to be able to dispense pharmaceuticals much more effectively and without the user error than what we see currently today. My father's a builder. One of the other calls you get back is that it's okay, we're going to send everybody off to do a trade and they will all be fine. My dad's a builder, and when I spoke to him about the capacity to 3D print a whole house from the ground up, he said, thank goodness I'm 72 and I've now retired. They are so good at 3D printing a house that they can print them like Lego blocks and stack them on top of each other to create whole massive buildings. And the technology that they have available means that you can 3D print everything, including the electrics, the plumbing, everything at once, and utilize the kinds of metals which allows you to take lights and stick them to the ceiling through magnets and then have the electricity conduct. So if we move the furniture around in our houses, potentially at one day I'd be able to move the pendant lights at the same time. Now that's pretty exciting for me because I like to shift furniture around in my house all the time, and the one thing that stops me is my husband going, you can't because the lights won't work. So I told him one day we'll have a 3D printed house and you'll never be able to stop me shifting the furniture. Drone technology, we can use it to deliver fast food, potentially putting Uber Eats even at risk. But what's more surprising is that there's technology being developed in the States which would allow large transportation companies to utilize air freight and not have pilots in their aeroplanes. One pilot could be flying up to 40 planes with cargo around the country at any one time. Now, I spend so much time in an aeroplane at the moment. The thought that there's a machine up there flying an aeroplane, or that one person is controlling 40 planes and he's had a big night or she's had a big night the night before and not quite on their game, really scares me. And we've all obviously seen driverless car technology. I think the only saving grace for us, or the biggest challenge here in Australia, is when that driverless car technology will be able to account for the movement of the unique animals that we have in Australia, like kangaroos that come and go in a hopping kind of way. So I know that's really depressing in some sense. Like, what's the point? Like, it's just going to change so much. How can we get ready? And I really like this statement from Brian Corby. So we may not be able to offer long-term employment, but we should try to offer long-term employability. And I think that's something, the word employability is something that lots of institutions are speaking a lot about at the moment. You'd be hard-pressed to walk into a university anywhere in the UK, the US and Australia without hearing the word employability thrown around somewhere. So what does it mean? Employability is kind of like learning analytics in the definitions that we use. And part of my work as the IRU Vice Chancellor's Fellow is to help our institutions think about employability in a slightly different way, or change the ways or broaden our conceptions of what employability is. Some people see employability in more of a narrow sense in terms of the skills that will help a student transition to the first job. And if we think about the metrics that our universities are measured on by the government, or how we're ranked in terms of how we do in employability, it is really based on that really limited outcome measure 4 months post graduation that says that if you have a job, you are successful, and if not, then your university potentially hasn't done such a great job at supporting your employability. I would argue that employability is a lifelong concept, and it fits with a lot of literature that's out there at the moment, in that employability and a university's role in that is to help students unlock the knowledge, professional skills, capabilities, and draw together all of the experiences that a student has across the course of the student life cycle, but also prepare them for life beyond that. Give them the skills so that they can adequately reflect upon all of their experiences for their whole lives and successfully transition from one career to the next, and potentially from one industry to the next. And that's where those concepts around transferable skills that we sometimes call soft skills really comes to the fore. To adequately address employability, we really need to be thinking about the student experience and student success as not only being about the student. It's not solely their responsibility to become employable, nor is it the sole responsibility of our careers and employment services. But the development of lasting student employability involves absolutely everything that we do at institutions, and it also involves absolutely everything that a student does outside of our institutions. It's their whole lives. It's kind of scary when someone said to me, Jess, work on employability. I was like, yeah, okay, that'll be fun. I've kind of been doing that. You really start to unpack it and you find yourself in the corner kind of rocking slightly, laughing hysterically, thinking, this is going to be so much fun. And it is so much fun because you can have a conversation with absolutely any academic about the ways in which their subjects and their service delivery is helping to support a student's employability. So I think about the work that we're doing in employability, and we can make a similar link then to the work that we're doing in student success. And that's how I would like to frame the rest of what I'm going to speak to you about today. And this image is something that I use a lot when I start to talk about the graduate transition, which is when we begin to realise graduate employability, or at least the time when our students start to really think about their employability. And we have laid a beautiful path out for them. It's a strong path. It's not going anywhere, but it's hanging over the abyss of the rest of a student's life. And unfortunately, the path we have laid is sometimes transparent. So our work in employability and our work in student success is helping students to better understand the path that's laid out for them and help them to build their own agency and confidence to allow them to walk along that path despite their horrible fear of heights. This is probably one of the better images of this pathway in China. The other ones that you search up, if you search up glass pathway in China, there are people literally holding on to the glass and scratching it because they're so scared. There's no way I could walk across that path. So what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to support students think about their lives and about their goals for the rest of their, potentially their careers, not in terms of an approach where they're pinning the tail on the donkey, but rather helping and empowering them to think really holistically about their lives. At Griffith University, which is my home institution, or was my home institution, now I live at 7, my role was the graduate advisor. And so we worked really hard with students to help support them to think about where they may want to take their careers and potentially how they wanted to engage with very diverse programs in the health sciences. And they would literally come into me, sit down in my office and say, Jess, what do I do with my life? I'm like, I don't know. You can't ask me. What are you interested in? And we'd have a whole conversation about that. But they wanted me to pick up the Harry Potter sorting hat, put it on their head and say, architect. And they go, but I'm in health sciences. You go, that's what the hat said. So helping them to think about that and unpack it is something that we could all potentially be doing a little bit better. So when we think about student success, employability is really only a small aspect of that. I like to think about student success around 6 big themes. So supporting access to university, helping students understand the value of a higher education experience and the depth of transferable skills that they will get from that experience and how it can transform their lives. How we advise students not only on the way in but throughout their program, and then supporting them on the way out of university. All of the experiences that we offer, the excellence that we provide in our service delivery, in our teaching, but also a student's own excellence in whatever shape that may take. There's a lot of talk at the moment about developing enterprise skills, entrepreneurship and innovation, and obviously then employability as well. So we think about student and graduate success. Again, it's really everything that we do. To do that well, to change the ways in which we think about higher education, to change the ways that students think about their degrees and the value of their degrees for the life of their careers, we need to think differently, and we need to support our students to think differently. Across Australia, across the sector, internationally, there is so much amazing work going on. Part of the challenge is we're not all sharing that information, and we don't all know what each other are doing. So how can we create a change that adds value? And that was basically what I was tasked with as the IRU Vice Chancellor's Fellow, to think about the ways in which then 6 institutions could work collaboratively to support student and graduate success. And the basis of that collaboration is really around sharing good practice and thinking about the ways in which we can take that good practice and scale it out across a whole institution and potentially across all of the innovative research universities. To develop innovative solutions if we haven't found one, obviously to collaborate, but importantly to evaluate the impact and disseminate the outcomes of that work, not just within the IRU, but across the sector. And that's the thing that really excites me about the project is, yes, it's designed to support the 7 institutions that we have as members, but it's not an exclusive set of knowledge. It's something that we're hoping can contribute in a long-term way. There are 4 projects, at least for the first round, coming to conclusion for the first 3 of those 4 projects in early next year. And we'll be looking for another set. So we're looking at employability achievement records and how we may go about doing that. There's a lot of those already out in the sector. University-wide experience subjects are the kinds of subjects that will help students to understand and reflect upon their experiences that may be having in entrepreneurship and innovation, that they may be gaining through global mobility activities, that they could also be gathering through industry partnerships or industry internships that may not directly be linked. So we're supporting students to gain credit for the activities that support their employability if their programs do not offer that already within them. That's particularly important within the context of our 7 institutions, because we do have such a high demographic of first-in-family students, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and students from socioeconomic disadvantage and rural and remote locations. One of the most exciting projects, I think, is Project 3, which is the Employability Resources and Professional Development for Staff. If we're going to think differently about the ways in which we support students to understand their employability, it has to be deeply embedded within the curriculum. And for that to be successful, academics have to understand what that means and what that looks like. And they need to be supported in terms of their own professional development, but also so they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they're embedding an industry site visit assessment into their subject that somebody else has. So we'll be developing a toolkit and a professional development program. Now, the one I would like to talk to you a little bit about today is our student-facing dashboard project. In this project, we're deeply partnering with students. And I think that's the most exciting part about this project, is we're asking students what they want and what they need from the kinds of analytics that we may be able to offer them. What's interesting within the IRU is that every university is in a different place in terms of learning analytics capabilities and rollout. And so for this project, we really needed to take a step back and think about what we know about learning analytics in all of its forms, and then how we can apply the data that we have to start to answer student questions. So I'm a biochemist. Yeah, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not, learning analytics isn't my bread and butter. So I came to this project with a very open mind about what we could think about in terms of the meaning of learning analytics. And there are lots of definitions out there in terms of what we understand learning analytics to be. And even within the learning analytics community, there are multiple definitions as well. We all understand that universities collect a vast amount of data about their students. Some of that data is able to be matched up within data warehouses or data lakes or whatever the next term is for the depth of data that we're able to collect together. But we have the capacity to collect information about our students' experiences, the way they engage, the challenges that they're facing within the learning that they're doing within our subjects, but also the challenges that they're facing engaging with the institution, potentially the challenges that they're facing in their private, personal lives, and the challenges that they're facing after they graduate, which is something that potentially a number of institutions are beginning to think about as well. But also the successes and where they end up. Huge amount of information. But what do we do with it? At the moment, large numbers of institutions are using demographic information to predict risk. And that is useful to some extent. We can predict those students who would be more likely to struggle in the transition to university, and we can offer them support. It's not foolproof in the way that we do it. And in the United States, I'm a little bit scared sometimes when I think about the US, but let's not go into the depth of that. In the United States, institutions are utilising demographic information and risk prediction to actively encourage students to withdraw from their studies so that they save themselves course load. Thankfully, here in Australia, we take the complete opposite approach, and an approach that a university like Georgia State does, in that the demographic risk is then used to help us provide tailored support to students. One of the underlying issues in that is that we often don't communicate to students why they're being contacted. And different institutions will approach the ways in which they contact students in different ways. Some using peer-to-peer reach out, and others using much more targeted programs involving more highly trained staff. Subject selection, Austin Peay University in the States is supporting students to use, to make decisions about which subjects they may want to take. And they're taking an analytics approach to this by mining the information that they have about student success in individual units. So more than 500,000 student records are fed into this system that will then help a student say, you did well on this subject, you're thinking about this major, potentially you could pick these subjects. It's an interesting model. Again, it's one cup in the question, but when we ask students what kinds of information they're interested in, some of the responses are, I want to know what subjects I'm going to be good at. I want to know what subjects I need to do to finish my degree. Or even something as simple as, I want to know what my GPA is without having to calculate it. So students are often having quite what we see as quite simple questions, that can change the ways in which they're experiencing the university. We've all seen the Signals project that's come out of Purdue, supported by Blackboard, and the changes that Blackboard are making now in the ways in which they're developing the student-facing dashboards. These kinds of dashboards or these kinds of analytics are helping us to unravel, in some sense, the ways in which a student's engaging with the LMS. LMS-based analytics, again, have a role to play, but there's a lot of information now that's gathering to suggest that perhaps a click rate through a course isn't necessarily the best way for us to be thinking about student engagement in their subjects. And dependent upon how we go about presenting that information back to students, a number of institutions are using that for academics to help them change the ways in which they're presenting their subjects to students. But when we go about presenting this information back to students, that's when there's a whole host of things that we're not quite sure are going to happen. We don't really know what's going to happen. I know an example of an institution that ran a randomised control trial where they used progress bars from the LMS. And of the subjects that utilised, of the cohort that had the progress bars, they were 60% more likely to either drop out of the subject or fail the subject based on the progress bars. The progress bars were demotivating for students. Unintended consequence. The initial design of that study was to roll progress bars out for all students. Thankfully, they took a controlled approach to the way in which they were doing it. So we were able to gather some data about what that looked like at that particular institution for that particular cohort of students. It's definitely not a blanket result that we can apply for all students in all disciplines. I think the work in engagement analytics is taking us to a place that thinks about student success much more holistically. So engagement analytics is drawing together a much larger source of information to help us to get a better picture about the ways in which a student is coming to campus, how they're engaging with their individual subjects, whether they're seeking out support. And there's multiple tiers to the ways in which we can utilise the kinds of analytics we have. I think the question is, though, do we know what questions students really want answered? Do we know what questions we could be answering that would help students lead them to the most appropriate and effective decisions about their learning? And we've probably seen this article that came out in the conversation in April last year that starts to talk about the limitations of learning analytics that are applied particularly out of a solely LMS-based approach. Oh, sorry about the weird formatting. So I really like the term data-driven student success as opposed to learning analytics, because we start to get into the definitional debate about what analytics is. And within our cross-institutional working group, a lot of the leaders in analytics from our institutions were thinking about learning analytics purely based around the data that we can get from students in terms of their learning, particularly from the LMS or any other source of data that gives us information about their learning. I would like to I am encouraging our group of institutions to start thinking about all of the ways in which we can use data to support student success. Their learning is obviously the most important reason why a student's at university. However, there are a number of other and the lives that they lead. If we're going to provide them with the kind of data that will develop student agency, that will help them to be responsive learners and to think really supportively about the ways in which they're making decisions about their learning and how we can inform institutional decision-making processes if we're not collecting adequate information about our engagement strategies and the supports that we're providing to students, whether they be HEP funded or SAF funded or core funded, how can we as institutions make really good decisions about the validity of that program in supporting student success? Now, that's not an easy solution, but I think we could potentially design analytics that would allow us to answer that question if we thought about utilising the technology in a way that focuses on the student rather than the systems we have in place. Now, those kinds of statements make me not super popular when I then go to the working group, because I come with a thought that, what if we could do this? How could we answer this question? I said, Jess, we're 5-10 years away from being able to have robust data that would allow us to answer those questions. Just because the system can't answer it now doesn't mean we shouldn't be striving to answer those questions in the future if they're important for student success. And I think that's really the foundation of the project that we're building off. The other really important component of the work is to unpack the ethical, moral, and legal implications and considerations around providing information back to students, and taking a step further to the information that we even collect from students. So a big part of the project is unpacking what students understand to be the range of data that an institution's collecting, how they understand that we're utilising that data, and what they would like to, how they would like us to communicate that better to them. A small piece of fine print that says that we will be collecting data about your engagement with the institution and that we will use it to support your learning and other activities is good, but potentially we have a role to play in supporting our students to better understand the information that we have available and asking them the ways in which they want to be communicated about it. It may be that they're not able to opt out of the collection of the data, but they should be able to have a choice to opt out about whether they receive potentially a student-facing dashboard. And they're the kinds of questions that we're unpacking for students. There is some evidence, not a lot, about student perceptions in terms of analytics dashboards, and there are very few examples of students as partners in a real holistic way in terms of the development of those analytics tools. And that's something that we're trying to address, at least at the beginning, to give us a sense of what are those key questions that students have. How can we map our data to better answer those questions? And if we can't answer those questions, what do we need to do as institutions to enable us to answer those questions in the long term? As I mentioned before, I'm really interested in the concerns that learners have about the use of their data and the data that's being collected. And I think there's a place for us to open a conversation and create the kinds of policies that are supportive not only for students in terms of their learning around the ways in which they use data, but to co-create policies around the use of data with students, which I know is scary, but the students are actually, they love this. They love the fact that our institutions are coming to them and saying, what do you think about this? They want to be part of the process. And I think if any of the work as students as partners has told us, we know that students want to be more engaged in the ways in which we design their learning and support them. The final component of the project is to start thinking about the ways in which we can visualise learning analytics to students in a manner that will be supportive of their learning. And the final aspect, did I say that was the final aspect? This is the final aspect, is to think about the support and training that we need to offer academic staff and students and professional staff so that they can better understand what the information actually means if we're going to present it in any form of analytics dashboard. And there's been a lot of work through the OLT and through other institutions about supporting academics to better understand the work. But there is a big piece of work for us to embark on in how we go about supporting students to understand the kinds of data that we may be able to present back to them, and how, again, we can communicate that more effectively. So for this to be successful, we have to collaborate, and I think that's one of the most exciting parts about this work, is that every institution who's involved in the project is laying it all out on the table. And really, the project itself is thinking not about how we can take something that's happening at one institution and mould that to another institutional context, but really stepping right back to think about what are those key questions, how can we work together, what can we learn from each other about the differing levels of analytical maturity at each of those institutions, to make sure that we're really taking a planned approach to the implementation of student-facing dashboards. I'd like to finish by having, giving a little bit of a spruik to our first step at collaborating across the IRU. I spoke with close to 500 academic staff and professional staff from across our 6 institutions, and with the sole purpose of trying to find out what our institutions were doing that potentially we could share. Now, obviously, we can't share or do all of the amazing things that I found, but I thought it would be remiss of me to spend that amount of time talking to people to then have that amount of knowledge just sitting in my head and not shared with everybody. So we've created the National Innovation Case Study Collection, which at the moment has over 115 cases of innovative practice from across the IRU. It is at the moment only showcasing IRU-based innovations, but it is not an IRU-only collection, and we would warmly welcome the increasing submissions from institutions from across Australia and also internationally. At the moment, we have close to 500 users on the registered within the collection, and I hope if you tag through to the website that you find it interesting. All of the ideas on there are linked to a staff member who's been involved in the development and implementation of that, and it's really designed to be a share and steal and collaborate across the sector wherever possible. So please, I encourage you to have a look at it. And if you're in Adelaide on Thursday, the Minister for Education is launching it at an event at Flinders, which is kind of exciting and scary all at the same time. So it's split up by 20 high-level themes. So if you have any activities within your institutions that you would like to share in that repository, we're more than happy to accept submissions. Thank you so much. I hope we're close to time, and thank you for your attention. Yeah, look, I'm open to questions, but I'm also open to discussion across the room because I'd really like to hear what other people think.